This is Ravi Anupindi from the Ross School of Business. I'm a faculty in the supply chain management area in the technology and operations group. I'm here with James Steele from Cisco. James is the program director for supply chain risk management that resides within the supply chain management team at Cisco. James was responsible for managing the impact of tsunami in 2011. James is a Ross MBA alum from 1998. So welcome, James.
Thank you, Ravi. Pleasure to be here.
So James, to start off, where were you during the tsunami? When the tsunami hit and when you got the news, where were you? And maybe you can open with that and then talk about what is the broader risk management system that Cisco has in place.
Sure. Yeah, actually, strangely enough, when the tsunami hit in March 2011, myself as well as one of the key members of my team, my crisis manager, were both on vacation at the time. I was in a cabin in Lake Tahoe, California, and he was proposing to his future wife in Phoenix, Arizona. So luckily, the real tradition on our team is that regardless of whether we're on vacation or where we're at in the world, we're always checking our email. We're always on top of what's happening globally in terms of incidents, particularly ones that would have impact to our supply chain. So I got the message late at night, I believe about 9 o'clock, 9:30 p.m. From my crisis manager, who got an email from our crisis alert service, and within a half an hour we were on the phone with members of my team, as well as starting to dial up members of our senior management team within supply chain as well. So despite the fact that we were sort of out of pocket at the time, we were very much dialed in, and we have access to our team and have the ability to have them on hot standby very quickly.
Okay, great. So before we get into some of the details about what you went through as you structured yourself to manage the tsunami, maybe it will be helpful if you can talk a little bit about how Cisco's risk management system actually works.
Sure, I'd be happy to. So I'm showing a slide right now that kind of provides just a quick overview summary of the entire supply chain risk management program at Cisco. So really there's four key elements of our program. And they're sort of multifaceted, if you will, from the standpoint that they're focused not only on execution in terms of mitigation of actual risks or events that hit our supply chain, but also proactive resilience as well in terms of building resiliency into our supply chain on a day-to-day basis as we make decisions in terms of where we source, where we build our network, and a number of other operational decisions. So you can see, just starting at the top, the most important element at the very top there, and the one that we'll be speaking about today, is really the incident management capability. And our incident management capability, I like to think of it as almost a series of volunteer fire departments, where my team is the central fire department, and when we have an incident, my team, and my team at the time was only about 9 people, is responsible for bringing together the larger organization relevant to actually understanding what an impact is going to be to our supply chain, and then actually mitigating it as well and executing on that. Now, in order to do that, we have a very concerted set of processes that we use in terms of assessing what the impact is, and then flowing that impact through to understand how it's going to affect customer orders, how it's going to affect new product launches, and a number of things. So my team is very much responsible for training the organization on that process, as well as maintaining the playbooks, as well as being sort of the vanguard, if you will, in terms of knowing on a 24/7 basis what's happening in the world and being on top of it, such that if there is something that will impact our supply chain, that we can alert the senior management team and begin pulling together this broader incident management team that we're responsible for. So the second part of our program, and again you can see this on the slide, is business continuity planning. Business continuity planning is really kind of the back office part of the supply chain risk management role. And in this capability, essentially we're responsible for collecting a wide variety of data points on all our key supply chain partners. So this includes our contract manufacturers. We've got 6 major contract manufacturers in the world, spread out over about 36 different locations. We've got scores of ODM providers that are providing finished product to us, and we've got over 1,000 direct suppliers, as well as our very extensive sub-tier. So my team's mandate is really to collect as much information in terms of where these suppliers and partners are located, what their disposition is in terms of fire safety, access to water, backup power, as well as what specific parts or products they're actually making, and ensuring that we've all got that in a database such that if there is an impact, we know exactly where the suppliers are at, how to contact those suppliers, and then an understanding as to what their risk position actually is. Now, the other two parts of the program, you can see manufacturing and test resiliency and product resiliency is really based on the second side of the equation I mentioned, which is really proactive resiliency. And as part of these two programs, it's our mandate on a day-to-day basis to identify where we think there's gaps in supply chain resiliency, and then go take kind of our modest investment dollars that my team has and combine that with broader investment that the rest of the enterprise has, and really mitigate those risks proactively. So for instance, we'll look at our overall supply chain network and identify where we think potentially there's a risk because we're overinvested in one part of the world, or we think that a specific plant doesn't have a capability, a risk protection capability that they need. And then we'll work through the broader supply chain organization to identify, articulate that gap, and then close that gap to the extent that it's a priority for us. So taken in totality, we're responsible for, kind of when the rubber hits the road, if there's an actual impact, my team needs to pull the folks together, and then we go mitigate. We're responsible for the data collection, and then we're responsible for proactive mitigation across to all the different aspects of the supply chain, from supplier management through manufacturing management and sourcing.
Great. That really sounds very comprehensive.
Yeah, it very much is. Cisco, we've been investing in this capability for quite a while. It's been probably 6 or 7 years since we sort of centralized the team, and it's got very good visibility, very good support with the leadership team as well as across the organization. And it's something that has proven itself out very well in a number of small disruptions, and certainly proved itself very well in the incident that we're going to talk about, the Japan tsunami.
Right. So speaking about the incident, I mean, as comprehensive as your risk management system is, the incident itself was at a scale that was unprecedented. In some sense, what you have on your hands is there's a combination of multiple things happening. There is the earthquake, there is tsunami, there's a nuclear disaster that is unfolding. How do you create a risk framework to think about all these multiple risks?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a great question. And I'll show a slide right now, and this is actually an artifact from our war room that shows a little bit about how we managed all the moving pieces. And we'll talk a little bit about how we organize from a war room standpoint. But just thinking about a framework, to your point, there were multiple impacts that happened. We had, the tsunami that eventually, was, part of the earthquake that eventually, overran the nuclear power station there in Fukushima. And then we had, a nuclear threat as well as power shortages and whatnot. So given all these different moving pieces and the fact that we had to communicate and manage, over 250 professionals within our supply chain and a number of folks across the corporate and other functional groups, we had to come up with a framework that was very, very simple, very, very straightforward, and allowed us to really manage what the actual impact of the situation was going to be. And this is something that we had thought about before the actual tsunami in a sort of a framework, if you will, that we've used in the past that has bode us very well. So the slide that I'm showing kind of gives a little bit of insight into that framework. And essentially what we did is that for every single node in our network that we thought that was either going to have impact from the tsunami or any of the other effects that we talked about, or potentially be at risk in the future, we essentially mapped it, and you can see we've got a snapshot there of Northeast Japan. We mapped it using our BCP, our business continuity planning data that I mentioned, and then we essentially judged it on a scale of 1 to 4. And you can see we've got scale from green, which is essentially no impact, through yellow, orange, and red. And red is really kind of the most critical impact, where, for instance, a plant or a specific node or a specific piece of infrastructure would be completely decimated from one of these effects. So essentially what we did is we set up this map and mapped all this out using our business continuity planning data, essentially got in contact with all our key suppliers or representatives, or had actual Cisco people on the ground to really give us a 24/7 read on what the ground situation was and how these impacts sort of played themselves out in terms of their manifestation on the actual supply chain. So for instance, if you take a look at the map, you can see up there in the top right-hand corner around the Fukushima plant, there's quite a few red dots there. And that's essentially us saying that we believe that in the future, because of the evolving nuclear situation, a number of those suppliers will not be able to be providing parts to us at all, simply because they've either been taken out because of the power situation, or people are just not going to be showing up to the plant. So because of that, we labeled them red, and that meant for us that that was the most critical part of the network that we needed to go mitigate. So at that point, we just assumed that we were no longer going to get any components or parts or products from those specific suppliers or partners, and then we had to go out and use a whole variety of other kind of tools at our disposal in terms of finding replacements by either using strategic inventory that we built up, by going out and finding qualified suppliers that could backfill for the suppliers that got impacted, or by doing spot buys in the market as well. And essentially having this framework of kind of, low impact to high impact, and then refreshing that on a daily basis based on all the information that we're getting from the ground level, helped us manage the evolving situation. So for instance, you can take a look here, and again, this is an artifact from the actual war room. You can see basically the same snapshot, and we use this framework to qualify impacts from the earthquake, qualify impacts from the flooding and the tsunami, and then the nuclear impact, and then you can see kind of more in the midterm, as the power situation was very critical in the months following the actual tsunami and earthquake. We had to continually monitor whether a number of these suppliers were getting power, what the quality of the power was, and we used this framework, and it was very applicable for all the different types of impacts that we had to deal with. And again, this is something that we've used before in the past, where you'd see a map and there'd only be 2 or 3 sort of dots, but we had to scale this up to the point where this was 20, 30 times larger than anything we'd ever seen. And actually scaled quite well, and based on the training within the organization, the people that we brought in the war room, people picked this up very quickly, and we were able to quickly get through the framework and get more towards the very challenging efforts of actually doing the mitigation and then tracking that. So.
Well, that's great. So that, talking about scaling, I mean, it seems like the technology platform scaled quite well, but the issue is, it's only as good as the BCP data that you have. Did you find, as you were populating the stuff, gaps in the BCP data set that you had put together, and how did you go about filling those gaps?
Sure, no, that's a great question. And in fact, when we went back and did our post-mortem, and after 100-day full-time effort, morning, noon, and night, weekends, with this entire kind of worldwide extended team, my team took the responsibility for doing a very extensive post-mortem over the course of a couple months to figure out, well, what went well, and what are the things that we want to replicate, what were some of the key gaps and challenges that we had, and what are the things that we can do to potentially close those to have even that much better of a response, the next crisis that we have. And one of the key things that we found was some of the challenges in the business continuity planning data that we had. So kind of going back to the way I explained kind of our overall capability, the business continuity planning data is really kind of the backbone of our response. It's basically our record of where all our parts are made, our products are made, where addresses are for plants, contact information in terms of who we can contact if a plant goes down or there's some type of impact, and then all the things I mentioned before around qualification, around what's the actual risk within that specific location. Now, the challenge is, as I mentioned, is that we've got over 1,000 direct suppliers, and then you can multiply that by a factor of 10 when you start thinking about our sub-tier, all our suppliers to our suppliers, if you will. And maintaining that database is a constant challenge for us, simply because we're bringing new suppliers on all the time, we're offloading suppliers, we've got new product introduction programs that are happening that are using suppliers that are not in our system, or part of this whole process of refreshing business continuity planning data, if you will. And we also have a number of acquisitions. I mean, Cisco has always been an acquisition machine. At any given time, we've probably got 10 to 12 companies that we're actively integrating that are not in our systems, our enterprise systems, and are therefore not part of our business continuity planning data. So we face kind of 2 challenges, and to your point, I think that was an Achilles heel for us, because you can only build a framework like this and operate it based on the quality of the data and your knowledge of where your suppliers are at and what parts they're actually making. So the 2 challenges that we had were, first, one, completeness of data. So I think even at our best effort, and we run the business continuity planning program on a yearly basis, we probably only have about 80 to 85% of our actual supply base, if you will, or partner base in our system at one time. And again, that extra 15% is very challenging to get, simply because that part of our supply chain is in flux, again, because of new product introductions or acquisitions. So, you can create a picture like this, but it's never going to be complete, and it's those corner cases, the things that you don't know, that you're not actively mitigating, that are going to become, a real challenge for you, farther on down the line as part of an incident response. So that's the first challenge, is completeness of data. The second is really accuracy of data, because if you think about it, again, working through, my team has to work through the sourcing management group, global sourcing management, through to the suppliers, and we do this on a survey basis. We have this whole web tool that we use. In that translation and in that sort of handoff with the data, you're always going to have inaccuracies in data. So for instance, we may get data for a specific supplier, but it may not show the actual plant or facility where a component is actually being manufactured. It may be the headquarters, or potentially, let's say the contact that we have has suddenly, at a supplier has actually moved on to a new role, and we don't have, the most recent contact. There's always going to be that churn, and that was a real challenge for us as well. So again, one of the things that we've tried to do as part of the postmortem and as part of the continuous improvement of the program is identify where we can get better data and more complete data simply by increasing the cycle by which we collect data, and then also just simplifying the survey that we use. We find that, if we, I think our business continuity planning survey was probably about 50 questions. We slimmed it down now to about 20, just to get the actual critical information that we need to go run a program like this. So a couple slides I can just show you on this. So for instance, as I mentioned, BCP is a cycle for us. We're running it on a survey basis. You can see that we have the ability through a web-based tool to essentially pull together a snapshot of our entire supplier and partner base worldwide. So for instance, you can just see a high-level picture, kind of using like a Google Maps tool. Every single little dot that you see on the map there is actual supplier or partner, and then we can zoom in on it and create a picture, as I mentioned, like this, and then begin populating it based on ground level data. So it's a very powerful process and a very powerful set of tools that we use, but there's always going to be challenges based on the scope, scale, and kind of drumbeat, if you will, of an enterprise as large as Cisco.
So in addition to, you mentioned the global sourcing group, were there other internal resources that you could leverage at the time of the crisis to put together to complete the BCP map? Because where Japan sits in the supply chain, you're talking about not tier one, maybe deep down in the tiers. So were there other resources within the company?
Yeah, there was, and that's an excellent call out, because in the end, we're very reliant on our tools and our data and things like that. But to really close the gap, that critical gap around accuracy or completeness, particularly as it related to our sub-tier, where we don't actually collect business continuity planning data, we had to very much rely on the expertise resident within Cisco. And across Cisco's supply chain, we've got a couple different organizations where we've got some very deep subject matter experts. They're not only in our global sourcing management group, the group that is responsible for building the relationship and setting the contractual framework, if you will, with our suppliers. But we also have a group called Technology and Quality that is really our deep subject matter experts that really know the commodity spaces very well, whether it's semiconductor or discrete electronic components, that not only know our tier one, but also our sub tier as well. And what we were able to do, and again, this was very much on an emergency basis, as we pulled together our map and began to assess the impacts, is that we had to pull on this community and bring them into the war room to say, hey, listen, there's a lot of sort of blind spots that we have, and we're really concerned that we've missed something in our business continuity planning as we set up what we think is going to be the impacts. And from this group of experts that not only know the commodity spaces but also know the players and have contacts in these companies, we're essentially able to lock them into a conference room with a whiteboard and have them map out at a very granular level, if you will, what some of our sub-tier looked like. And then, from those maps, we were able to start reaching out to some of our sub-tiers directly or through some of our tier one suppliers as well to really assess, okay, what are the things that we don't know? So for instance, I'll give you an example. You take a look at the sub-tier within our overall supply chain. The example I'm using here is a very complex product, Cisco optical services router. This is something of the order of a couple $100,000 that we sell to service providers. Now we're sourcing line cards and discrete components from our tier ones, but if you start backing up into tier 2, tier 3, tier N, and you start getting into assemblies, into discrete components, into actual raw materials. And because we don't deal with a lot of those suppliers on a direct contractual basis, simply because we work through them through our directs, we don't have a whole lot of visibility into those suppliers. And a lot of those suppliers actually resided in Japan. There's a lot of very highly engineered commodities that have a deep supply chain in Japan, particularly Northeast Japan, where we had the impact. And through bringing in these subject matter experts and then working through our existing partners, we're able to begin to map this out and then really query that sub-tier as to what their impacts were. And, for instance, this is just a map of a single commodity space. I think it's optical. You can see that the picture that we put together just for our direct suppliers was complex enough. And then you start parsing that into different commodities, and you start getting a whole host of different pictures like this. And that's where the complexity really came into play. But again, using this framework that we had around kind of low impact to high impact, and then the fact that we were able to basically organize kind of sub-war rooms that focused on commodities and get these subject matter experts together, we're able to begin to mitigate those risks that at the very beginning we didn't have visibility into, but within a week or two we had very good visibility into, and we're able to start figuring out whether, okay, there is no risk, let's not worry about it, or there is a risk and we're going to go mitigate it. So I guess to your point, you can rely on systems and data as much as you think it's complete and accurate, but in the end it's a lot of just elbow grease and getting the right people in a room, and getting a framework that you can trust, and then beginning just to work through the very challenging part of dialing and talking to suppliers on the ground and beginning to really mitigate things as they occur.
Wonderful. As the risk is unfolding, what is the risk management plan you put in place? And you mentioned a couple of times the notion of a war room. What was the structure of the war room? How did you actually manage the war rooms?
Sure. Well, so we talked a little bit about business continuity planning. So as I mentioned before, one of the key and most visible capabilities within the supply chain risk management program at Cisco is this incident management team, and the incident management team is really part of my overall team. And what our mandate is, again, is to monitor 24/7 what's happening, but also be the keeper of the process and the playbooks and the organization principle, if you will, and the training that goes along with that around how to respond to an incident. And to your point, the war room that we put together for Japan was bigger than anything that we'd ever put together. But we have had a lot of experience in the past, over the past 6 or 7 years, of managing smaller incidents where we've been able to vet and develop a process of divide and conquer. And some best practices around how to develop a war room to begin mitigating an incident. So I'll give you a snapshot of what our overall sort of structure for a war room looks like. And I'm showing a slide right now, and there's obviously a lot on that slide. But one thing I'll call to your attention, well, there's actually two things. The first is that at the very top you can see there's the supply chain risk management team and the senior leadership team within the structure of our war room is kind of the single point of accountability. And my team is really given the task of facilitating the conversation between all the people that we have that are manning the tracks, and I'll talk a little bit about what the track structure is, and then facilitating senior leadership to help them get the information they need to make decisions around what is it that we should be mitigating, what's the most, the highest priority that we've got, and then how are we tracking against progress, and how much money are we spending, and all the key things that you would want to manage as part of any major enterprise level effort. So just to think about the way that we pull together a war room, my team has got the mandate, if you will, to bring together the war room and to manage who we basically bring together to lead the different tracks. And the way that we manage the war room, it's almost like a divide and conquer. So you can think about, so for instance, where there's an incident, we'll put a box around that incident. And the incident could be as small as like a plant fire, at a single node, or maybe there's a smaller scale earthquake and it's a couple suppliers in a region. But essentially, regardless of the size of the incident or the number of suppliers or partners involved, we'll put a box around it and say, okay, we need to understand what's in that box that has impact on our supply chain. How many suppliers, how many partners? What's the infrastructure inside the box in terms of things coming in, things going out? And what's the disposition of that? Then we need to bring in a whole number of other folks that are going to help us with communications, with talking not only internally within Cisco, folks like our engineering teams and our marketing teams, but also externally with our stakeholders, our shareholders, our customers. So we look at it very much holistically, in that we need to bring in all these various elements, not only the supply chain folks, but also all the other folks across the functions within Cisco that can help us mitigate and communicate impacts to our stakeholders and our customers. So again, you can see within our war room, we track it up based on all those elements that I have. We've got folks that own the supplier track, folks that own a logistics track, folks that own a track that communicates with our manufacturing partners, because our manufacturing partners have the best visibility into how the actual supply is going to be disrupted coming into the plant. We have a track around customer communications, a track around internal communications, and then a track that essentially manages all the costs that we have associated with mitigating any type of impact. And what we do within this war room, again, is that we have the track leads who are responsible for communicating with their teams across the organization. We have the senior leadership team, and then we have my team. And essentially, we will meet on an ongoing basis, typically once a day, until we, the senior leadership team, in conjunction with my team, makes a judgment that we're no longer going to manage this as a crisis, and we're going to push it down into normal run-the-business processes. Now, sometimes within a war room, that process will happen in the matter of a couple days, because we'll get a handle on the incident, and then we'll begin to manage it, and then begin to push it back to the organization. In incidents like the Japan tsunami, or something like the Thailand floods that happened about 8 or 9 months after that, we ran this as a crisis and as a full war room with a set of cascading war room teams over the course of about 100 days. And that meant that we were meeting 2-3 hours a day with this entire globally based team. And then we had this group of about 200-300 professionals worldwide working on this full time for a whole 100 days, until we said, okay, we believe we got all the impacts mitigated, and we can now move this to standard processes, business processes, if you will. So again, it's very complex, I think, in the way we describe it, but again, we've run a number of drills, and every single time we have an incident, whether it's large or small, we always try and refine the process, and then again push our most recent learnings and our most recent sort of approach back out to the organization. So each of the key folks and leaders within the organization are ready to execute on this when we actually need them to do it.
Great. I mean, just the sheer scale and the complexity of the incident that you had to manage. How did you go about prioritizing what Cisco should be doing first?
In terms of how we prioritize, we used a combination of the framework, as I mentioned, this qualification framework around what the impact was, and then our war room, and then a set of standard metrics that we've developed to track processes and their impacts and their effect around how we're mitigating. So for us, the key priority for us was really identifying what are the nodes within our network that have had the most impact. And again, that kind of goes back to this rating system that I described before. And we were very quickly, I think within the first couple days, based on reaching out to our supply partners, talking with Cisco people that were on the ground in Japan, able to very quickly identify what were those key nodes or partners that had the most impact. What were the ones that were underwater? What were the ones that had really taken a lot of damage from the earthquake, and then what were the ones that were the closest to the nuclear power situation. So once we were able to identify which nodes or partners really had the most impact, it was a process that we used, and again, this is part of the war room and our playbooks, of understanding, okay, if these partners are going to be down for, let's say, a week or 2 months, or completely off the map because we think the plan is completely destroyed, we're able to flow that through a number of systems that we have within Cisco supply chain planning process to understand what the impacts are going to be, not only for customer orders that we've got, in, let's say, the next couple weeks, but more importantly over the next couple months, and then begin formulating a plan around, okay, based on how quickly we can mitigate, based on factors like whether we have an alternatively qualified source, or whether we've got extra inventory, or just the nature of the commodity and the impact, how quickly are we going to be able to replace that supply? And then over the course of that time and matching that, what's going to be the gap? And is that gap going to be so critical that we're suddenly going to start missing customer orders or delivery dates? Or if it's not going to be us missing, but it's something where there is going to be an impact, we need to very quickly communicate to customers. So we have this whole process and set of metrics that we go through to understand, and we were able to create kind of what we called heat maps that really show on a customer by customer basis, and we're talking about hundreds of customers. What are the impacts to the orders right now in the next couple weeks, in the next couple quarters? And then we began to formulate these Tiger teams, customer-facing teams, where we matched key executives, and it was typically sales account executives as well as supply chain executives, to go have very proactive discussions with our customers about what these impacts were going to be. And if it was something where, let's say, we couldn't get a product, based on an order commitment that we had, we'd be able to communicate to them when we would be able to get that order, or begin to work with them and some of the people that are deploying a network or whatnot that need our equipment around alternatives for that specific product. Maybe we can go to the next higher product set and replace it with that. So the way that we prioritize, again, really is almost sort of working backward from the customer, because that's what the mitigation is all about, is really getting visibility into the impacts as quickly as we can, flowing that through to understand what the impact of the customer is going to be, and then really getting out in front of the customer and having those discussions such that there's no surprises and we give them as much visibility into the impact as we possibly can. And I think that's really kind of the success, if you will, that our war room allows us to have, is the fact that instead of spending a week or two or three organizing a team and trying to kind of create a process in the middle of all this chaos, we've got a tested, vetted process that people are trained on, and we've got the tools and the processes in place such that we can focus on understanding what's the impact, not only at the ground level, but what does that mean for our customers and our stakeholders. And then bringing that all together and then working mitigation on a day-to-day basis, such that within the first week and a half, we had our arms around the situation and felt very confident that regardless how bad or worse the situation would get with the nuclear zone and the lack of power and things like that, that we would be able to stay on top of it, and we would be able to be out in front of our customers having these conversations such that they don't feel the pain, if you will.
Great. So a key element of the risk mitigation and management plan is communication.
Yes, very much
so. What did you do in the communication space, specifically, internal communication and external communication?
Yeah. Well, you're exactly right, and I would say that's the key element within incident management, and certainly within supply chain management when we're dealing with an actual crisis, is communications. Because we can do as much mitigation as possible, and we can have a great war room, but unless you're communicating to the people that need to have answers, you'll end up being failure or being seen as a failure by the folks that actually matter, the customers and our stakeholders and whatnot. So for us, as part of the years that we've been investing in this capability, we found that in order to really have good communications, we have to make them a full partner in our incident management war room. It can't just be all supply chain people working on this. So as part of our war room, if you go back to the slide that I showed a variety of different tracks, from day one we bring in not only our team of supply chain operations communications folks, and we've got a centralized team that helps with the communications and helps with the coordination across the organization, but we also bring in corporate communications as well and functional communications teams as well. So we'll have all the communications representatives, and supply chain in conjunction with the corporate groups will be responsible for having a unity of messaging as well as having sort of a release plan of the messaging as well. And that's really where organizations and stakeholders can get very I think frustrated, is that if there's multiple messages coming at different times, it can create a lot of chaos, and there's kind of that fog of war. But for us, we've tried to, again, bring communications in as a partner and really begin to coordinate from day one what the communication is going to be to ensure that we've got consistency and that we're addressing concerns for all these various stakeholder groups. Because what a customer wants to know versus what the engineering teams internal within Cisco or the marketing or sales teams need to know is very different. I mean, there's a lot of parallels, but they all have different sort of needs, if you will, that are going to help them manage this crisis for their stakeholders as well. And by partnering and having a very strict communications protocol and set of guidelines, we've been able to make that process very consistent. Now, there's a lot of improvements that we've done over the years that we've learned about from doing these, but I think that that was a key for the success in the Japan crisis, is that we're able to communicate very clearly with customers, get the information that they needed, and be very proactive. And we did that not only with customers, but also with our stakeholders internally within the company, which is very important as well. And again, it all goes back to the fact that we've thought through this process very proactively and have really tried to learn from doing over the years of managing these type of crises, and it worked out very well for us in Japan.
That's great. To conclude, we're getting a very comprehensive picture of how you managed through this major incident. Now, to conclude, if you will, could speak about what was the overall impact of the tsunami on the organization?
Sure. Well, I think there's a lot of companies that would agree with the fact that this was the largest supply chain disruption I think that we've had in modern times. If you think about all the risks that having a globally dispersed, very lean supply chain, not only within the electronics and high-tech vertical, but also within auto and specialty chemicals and whatnot. There's just a number of risks that we've all known about, but really haven't manifested themselves until we have a major disruption, in a huge geographical area like Japan. So for Cisco, this was certainly the most impactful incident that we've ever had. Certainly right up there with the 2008 financial crisis, which was a crisis of a completely different nature. And within a day or two, we knew that for us the revenue exposure was upwards of $1 billion plus, which essentially means that if we did mitigate right away and very completely, $1 billion of revenue would potentially be at risk for the company. And if you think about the time that this happened back in March of 2011, it was a very challenging time for Cisco, a very challenging time for the industry in terms of pressure on our margins, pressure on our overall financial performance. So it was critical for us to manage through this very, very carefully and very, very impactfully, simply because we didn't want any impact to margins, bottom line, top line, or anything for those quarters that we had to deal with this. So it was very scary, initially, just given the exposure that we had. I think also, just to give you a sense in terms of the scope of what the impact was, within a week we knew that we had 65 direct suppliers to Cisco within the region that had some type of impact, whether they had were underwater or whether they just had a power disruption. It was 65 of our major suppliers, and quite a lot in our sub tier as well. So it was very, very impactful for us. So overall, just in terms of thinking about, well, what were the actual results of all this work that we did, the people in the war room and the process that we've invested in the end, we had absolutely no impact to revenue whatsoever, and we had no impact to margin either over the course of the 2 or 3 quarters that this transpired, this whole impact to Cisco within Japan transpired, and we were very proud of that. I think we had about 160 direct customer inquiries that we, again, had these tiger teams that matched Cisco supply chain as well as sales and marketing executives, such that we were able to have discussions with all these major customers. And again, these are major enterprise customers like banks and auto companies, as well as all our major service provider customers around the world. So we're able to have these discussions on an ongoing basis and build kind of this liaison with them over the course of a couple quarters to ensure that they knew what was happening, what the impact of their orders would be, and then how we could potentially work around that based on their specific needs. So again, given the fact that it was over $1 billion revenue at risk, and we were able to manage through it with absolutely no impact, was I think validation or vindication for the investments that we've made in this capability, and we were all very proud of it. I think the thing for me personally and my team that was the most satisfying is that I think it was our Q3. It was either Q3 or Q4 of calendar year 2011, John Chambers actually called out our team as well as the broader incident management team from the supply chain organization as being, real saviors of the quarter in terms of our ability to have that kind of performance. And it's very satisfying because typically, within supply chain and operations, you don't get called out by, any major I think, C-level executive in the open press unless something has gone terribly, terribly wrong and it's had an impact. And for us to get a call out around, the great performance that we had and all the hard work that paid off for the company was very satisfying and very much, I think, an indication of strong success for us in this instance.
Well, congratulations. And on that note, thank you for coming and sharing your thoughts and experiences on this crisis management.
Oh, my pleasure. Yeah, thank you, Ravi.